Okay, so I just want to quickly run through the lessons we've done so far, just so that we think about what we're doing today as a continuation of everything we've done up until this point. So we started with the grisaille, a simple grisaille still life, a simple geometric form. And I asked people to understand as best as possible um, how light on a simple object works. I wanted people to identify the elements of light and shadow that we've talked about. So again, those are always identifying the light mass and the dark mass, both of the form itself and the space that the form is in. Identify the elements of light and shadow, such as halftone, core of the shadow, reflected light, cast shadow, the shadow accent or the occlusion shadow, the highlight. And those are all elements of light and shadow that you should be continuing to look for as you continue to develop the paintings in the class. So that, if you'll excuse my very poor photograph of this, we talked about planar structure, and that's a concept, again, we're going to be talking about throughout the semester, not frequently, but throughout the semester. So planar structure meaning how planes, so broad flat areas, respond to light, right? So a plane is going to be more prominently illuminated the closer it is to being square to the light source or directly facing the light source. So we talked about how the planes on these objects are illuminated to a greater or lesser degree depending on their relationship to the light source. And when a plane, such as the plane on the far right on this form, is completely turned away from the light source, it's going to be in shadow. The planes that are most directly facing the light source are going to be illuminated in what we call the center light. And then as planes turn away in different degrees from the light source, we lose the ability to fully see the value or the local value of the plane. And the plane is progressively darker as it starts to roll away from the light source. And then we talked about how we could understand an organic form, analyze and understand an organic form in terms of its planar structure. So we did this demonstration of a pepper where we tried to understand the complexity of a natural form as a series of planes that, like the simple forms we talked about in this image, the light and shadow on the organic form, we read the light and shadow depending on how much the plane of the organic form is facing the light source. So we talked about the planes that are most directly facing the light source and about planes that are slowly turning away from the light source until we get to the shadow mass. And all of that painting was done using white and Payne's gray, which is a kind of black. Again, as I've said before, it's a blue-black. This is a still from a YouTube video by an artist and teacher I've mentioned named Stephen Bauman. And this is his planar analysis of a pear. So his is a little bit more regular, in a sense, imposing a more regular planar structure on the pear, but it's the same idea. So that we understand those planes that you can see clearly illustrated here that are most strongly facing the light source are the most strongly illuminated. And as each plane turns away from the light source, it goes further and further into shadow. What else to say about this? So, I prefer to interpret the planar structure more based on the specifics of the natural object, but either approach is a good approach. And so we won't necessarily be doing any more paintings where we so explicitly construct a form or a volume in space according to this kind of planar analysis. We will, but we want to bear that kind of planar thinking in mind going forward. I'm going to skip this section. I wanted to talk about a use of black and white or white and shades of gray in historical painting. I'll get to this later, or I'll talk about this maybe next week. So today we're going to be moving into color for the first time, although very slowly. We're not going to be dealing with anything like a full palette. In fact, we're just going to be adding one color to the palette we're already using, which is just white and Payne's gray. This is an image of a traditional, what's called a color wheel. We'll get more into the details and the uses of a color wheel later in the semester. But right now, I just want to pull it out to show you, or to start talking about warm and cool. So we're going to be thinking about our painting today in terms of warm and cool colors. And I like to call the painting we're doing today a warm, cool painting. So when we're thinking about warm and cool, if it's a concept, a color concept that's new to anybody, it's a relatively simple color concept. We're just talking about, when we say warm colors, we're talking about those colors that we identify through convention, really, as being warmer than colors we identify, again, through convention, as being cooler. So warm colors are typically identified as yellows, oranges, reds, red-violet perhaps, although a color like red-violet becomes maybe more subjective in exactly how we would identify that. And then cool colors are greens, blues, violets, colors on that side of the color spectrum. Again, warm and cool, it may be a subjective call when we get to colors like yellow, green. And we can also start to talk about relative color temperature. So we all may say that this blue here, this conventional color wheel blue, which is roughly equivalent to a blue we're going to be using called ultramarine blue. We may say that this blue is cool, but we may also say that this blue is warm relative to this blue. So some people may see this blue as slightly cooler than this blue. Now this is a kind of famous, that's an overstatement, but it's a very common debate among painters, which of the blues are warmer or cooler than the other. Some people call this blue warmer because it's closer to red, that's how they perceive it. Some people call this blue warmer because it's closer to green, which is how I perceive it. I perceive this blue and this blue as warmer than these two. But again, that's getting a little bit off topic today. So we're going to be talking about warm and cool colors. So just to get into that a little bit, these are two paintings by a contemporary artist named Lisa Yuskavage. And I would ask which painting we would identify as warm and which we would identify as cool, but I think it's obvious, right? So the painting on the left, which I believe is called Big Girl Smoking from 1996. Obviously the painting on the left would be a warm painting. The painting on the right would be a cool painting. I used to have a teacher, or my first college painting teacher, said to us that all paintings are either warm or cool, or virtually all paintings are either warm or cool. I think he said all paintings are either warm or cool. I don't think that that's true, but that's often true. So these are two paintings by the early and mid 20th century painter Aaron Douglas. And And you can see that he's working in primarily, what would we call this painting? What's the primary temperature of the painting on the left? Anyone want to? This is maybe a little bit more ambiguous than the Lycia Scabbage. Any thoughts here?
I would say in comparison to the painting on the right, it's definitely the cooler of the two.
Yeah, cooler. But do you think it's, so just based on the way you responded, do you find it somewhat less clear looking at these two paintings that this is a cool and this is a warm painting, as opposed to, say, the Lycia Scabbage paintings we just looked at?
Yeah, it's definitely a little more ambiguous because there's so many red tones
Yeah,
in the left painting.
yeah, that's true. So we might read these, or these start to move. If we're calling these reds, these would certainly be cool reds, right? But that's true. This starts to move into warmer temperatures. And the painting on the right, we might read the browns as relatively cool compared to the more orange earth tones here. So I want to talk very briefly before moving on to the demo about the color of light. So here in these two paintings, there is certainly a temperature to the light in these paintings. But we didn't talk about these paintings that way. We talked about these as what we might call the local color temperature, the temperature of the color as we would just conventionally identify it. So we might say that this yellow here is a warm, this blue is a cool, and we're not so much talking about these colors as they are influenced by the color of the light. Same with these paintings. But I do want to talk about the temperature of light, which is going to be a very important consideration for us. So these are two paintings of interiors. On the left is a painting by an artist named Gwen John. It's early 20th century. I don't remember the exact date. On the right is a roughly contemporary painting, or contemporary to Gwen John, by a painter named Anna Aschen, who's a Swedish painter. We have two different light sources, or two different types of light, two different temperatures of light. So which painting can people identify as a cool light source, and which painting has a warm light source, and why? And why do you make that identification?
The painting on the left, I see a warm light source, and the painting on the right, I see a cool light source. The left, probably because looking through the window, we see a little bit more warmth in the window, like we see yellow in the window. I don't know if that's just because of the wall around it, but then to the right, when we look at the window, it's just white, like I don't see a lot of yellow.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, this is a little bit, I see what you're looking at. This is a little bit of a trick question that I always give my students. And the way you answered, Morgan, is almost always the way that question is answered. And I do this just because I think it's really important to consider what we're looking at, to really look at what's happening. I mean, your analysis, I think, is spot on in a sense, Morgan, because we could certainly read the light here as being a relatively yellow light. And then here it's true, we see this reads as white. Although I do see this as a slightly warm white, right? If we're going to say a warm or a cool white, I suppose it may vary depending on your screen. This could read as, you know, for me, certainly looking at it, it's a yellow light. But also, let's look at the light hitting this child's head, and then the light hitting the floor here. So do people see how those are actually warm? And then if we think about the color of light, this color is actually, now the warmth we're seeing here, let's say the warmth we're seeing here, or the warmth we're seeing here, is a warmth that comes from the local color of those objects. So here we're looking at yellow wallpaper and the local color of that. So the color that the local color is, in a sense, the color name we associate with an object, or it's the color that we're able to perceive when an object is fully illuminated. There's a warmth to this, right? There's a warmth to this tabletop because all of these local colors are warm. Maybe the exception here, it's a white, but it looks like it's tending towards the warm. This painting we read initially as a cool painting. So overall, this is a cool painting. Overall, this is a warm painting. And that throws us a little bit at first. But I think if we really look at these two paintings, we'll see that if we ask ourselves, what's the temperature of the light hitting this child's head or this floor here, or the temperature of the light coming into the room here or here, I think we'll see a cool light as opposed to a warm light. And what's happening in this painting, the painting on the right, is we're getting direct sunlight, right? Direct sunlight, and we can identify that because of the clarity of the shadows. So when direct sunlight is coming into a room, there's a kind of sharp shape-like clarity to the light and to the shadows. Whereas in the painting on the left, we're getting a much more diffuse light, right? We don't quite get that same sharp shape-like clarity to the light masses. So we have this light mass here, but the light and shadow is much more diffuse. It's much softer. So this is indirect daylight. So this is, obviously this is a room illuminated during the day, but the sun isn't directly shining into this room. What we're getting is light bouncing off other surfaces. In this case, this is probably a north-facing room. So we're getting light bouncing off the sky and coming into the room as a relatively cool, a kind of blue-gray light source. And then you'll notice in this painting that the shadows are warm, right? Or relatively warm. So we have this kind of gold gray shadow here. The shadows, or the parts of this table that are in shadow, are relatively warm. This light brown color of the wood of the table, where the light's hitting it, is relatively cool. This is relatively cooler than the shadow. So the light source is cool. The shadows are tending to be warm. You'll often notice that with light. We hear the lights are warm, and then the shadows go very cool. Even this, we can read it as, this is a blue wallpaper, obviously, but it started to be a warm blue because of the sunlight hitting it. So we want to think both about color temperature in terms of local color, but we also want to try to identify the temperature of the light source. And think about how the temperature of the light source is influencing our perception of the colors in the painting. So I'm actually gonna stop there and move on to the demonstration. We can talk more about this as we talk more about color. In this painting, which we've looked at before, this is a painting again by the 19th century French painter Ingres. This is a model illuminated by indirect daylight in an old studio. So this is a cool light source. Remember, indirect daylight. So daylight that's not direct sunlight, but indirect daylight. Again, probably a north-facing window, which is going to have indirect daylight all day long. this studio would have been using north light windows to illuminate their model. So they had the same light all day long. So we have a cool light source, and as a result of that, we have relatively cool skin tones. So we could imagine if there was a hot light source, so something like a light source that was available at the time, maybe candlelight or direct sunlight, or in our time, an incandescent bulb, we would read these passages of illuminated skin as warmer than we're reading them here. This is a kind of dull, cool yellowish color. And then notice how the shadows go warm, right? These are warm shadows, in part, no doubt, because the light's reflecting off of surfaces and picking up some of the warmth in the reflective surfaces. So anyway, today we're going to be adding one color, the transparent red oxide I asked you to buy, to our palettes. And we're going to be doing a warm, cool painting, a painting where we try to identify relative values of warm and cool color. All right, so. Okay, so everyone can see my setup?
Yes.
Yes, I can see your.
Okay, and just let me know, make sure if you can't hear me well, just let me know, please. Okay, so our colors today, we're going to again be using the colors we began the semester with. So we're going to be using white. And Payne's gray, or if anybody just has black, again, that's okay. It's better to use Payne's gray, but black will do. And then transparent red oxide, or my version of it is transparent earth red. That's probably your version too. So you may not be able to see that so clearly on the camera, but I'll show you. So this is a warm color when we see a little bit of white in it. So it's usually we call these colors earth reds. It's a kind of, we could think of it as a kind of brown, but it's really a kind of earth red. So I'm going to just get started, as we always do. I'm going to start the drawing again with the same straight line approach I've used in the past. So, and your view of the orange is slightly different than mine. I'm a little bit more centered to the orange. So I'm going to do a lot.
Professor?
Yes?
I had a quick question.
Sure.
Are you using natural light from the window, or are you using like an actual lamp?
Actually, so I have both. I'm next to a window.
Okay.
I have natural light, but I also have that's a good question. Thanks.
Yeah, I was just curious what kind of, yeah. you were trying
Yeah,
to.
so I have a window here,
Okay.
and then I have this light here.
Okay, perfect.
I think that's a light, I think that's made, I don't actually know what it is, but it's the artificial light I'm supplementing my setup with is also a cool light source. It's a light source that approximates daylight.
Okay.
So the main
Thank you.
light source hitting the orange is a cool light source. So again, just using that same straight line approach I talked about. And again, the straight line approach is we're using this, or I'm using this here, because a really important element in making a convincing contour drawing is setting up the relationship on the contour between high points. So in other words, I want to identify important high points on the shape and then see how they relate to one another. I'm going to measure width to height of the orange to decide if my proportions are accurate. So the width should be just a little bit shorter than the height, so that's about right. So this is obviously a very simple form, although it may be like many forms we draw. Deceptively simple to get. Okay, so I've drawn the contour. I'll indicate simply the navel on the orange. And I'm looking at that. I'm trying to carefully identify the shape of that. So it's a shape, I'm looking at it in perspective. Okay, so now this, if people remember, we call this the contour, and I've used that term several times today. And I'm going to indicate the place where I can perceive the division between the tabletop and the back wall this orange is sitting on, and it's relatively low on the form. A little bit, I perceive it a little bit differently than you're seeing it on the screen, just because my eye height is a little bit different than the height of the camera. And so because of the placement of the light, this cast shadow appears to project out below the orange, and then it moves backwards in space along the tabletop. And then as you're seeing, I see I see the cardboard division here. I'm going to make the painting as if that cardboard division doesn't exist. I'm just going to imagine this painting as an orange placed on a table without that little box. Now, to me, this, I'm not going to change this, but I just want to point out, to me, this composition, as simple as it is, and by composition, I mean the placement of the elements on the rectangle that I'm using, or whatever surface it is I'm using. This placement seems a little bit heavy to the right. I'm not totally pleased with how the orange and the cast shadow gives a little bit too much weight to one side. This seems a little bit empty. I'm not going to change that just because I don't want to. No real point in prolonging the demonstration for that purpose. But just thinking about composition later in the semester, we'll talk about that. I don't think this is great. As simple as this painting is, I think it could have been better composed. And then so this, I've traced out the cast shadow, and then I'm going to trace out the shadow pattern as I see it on the orange. And so I am thinking here, as I'm looking at cast shadow, describing the major planar break in the orange, which I think everybody can clearly see is coming down the orange like this. Right? That's the main point on the orange where there's a division of light and shadow. And I'm going to be very I'm not just going to do something like this in finding that cast shadow. Because that doesn't, a quick S-curve line, which we could think of this as a kind of S-curve, but that's not really going to describe the way the form's moving. So I really want to get a sense of how the planes on this orange are moving up and down the complexity of the form. And right around here, as we move to the top of the orange, the shadow pattern wraps around a kind of top plane. So it's almost as if we can think of a plane being here on top of the orange, a plane that's almost like a top plane. Right? The orange is a little bit rounder. It doesn't exactly have a table-like top plane, but it has a kind of angled top plane. We see this top plane here. And that plane is receiving sunlight, right? So this plane here is still receiving sunlight, not as much as that, but some. And so the point where the form goes into shadow, or that contour, where the form goes into shadow is a contour that really moves backwards in space like this, and clearly defines for us not only the form turning around in space this way, but also the form turning around in space that way. And so this is a carrying forward of the same kind of planar thinking we did very explicitly in the last painting. Now, a really important thing to look for in this object, in thinking about light and shadow in general, is I think that people will see that the shadow mass on the right-hand side of the orange is very clear. That shadow mass continues down the orange and along the bottom of the orange. So here, under here is all in shadow. So let's trace that shadow pattern. Look really carefully and you'll notice the shadow pattern continues, doesn't end here, although some people may read it as ending there, because this shadow is relatively lighter than this shadow. Notice that there continues to be a shadow shape along the bottom of the orange. It's sort of paralleling the bottom contour. And what's happening, there's a narrow foreshortened plane, again paralleling bottom contour of the orange, that's still in shadow, but we're reading it as relatively light. Why? Why is this part of the shadow, why do we perceive that as much lighter than this part of the shadow? This is something we've talked about, an important aspect of light. Anyone remember why would we be reading this part of the shadow as considerably lighter than this part?
Because
It's reflecting off the table.
Right, so there's a considerable amount of light reflecting off of the surface right here. And it's filling in this shadow. And so this part of the shadow is considerably lighter. But we want to make sure to treat it as a shadow so that we fully describe the movement of the volume, or we fully describe the volume of the object. We don't want this to remain light in our painting and therefore seem to be flat. Because if we keep this part of the painting light, then it's going to read to us as facing the light source the same way this plane is, instead of rolling down around in space away from the light source. So we want to make sure to always identify the shadow mass, even when the shadow mass is receiving a considerable amount of reflected light. So we're at a point in the painting where we can start blocking in. And so what we're doing today, we have our white, we have our black, and we have our transparent red oxide. And we're going to be identifying the masses of color and masses of light and shadow in terms of relative warmth and what's relatively warm and relatively cool. So we're obviously not going to be matching colors. We're going to be using our three colors to start to suggest the relationship of warm and cool colors, and even maybe possibly warm and cool light. So just as always, I'm going to start the painting by blocking in the background. So I'm losing my Payne's gray. And the background is a blue. And on my screen, it reads as a blue. So my guess is probably, for you all, you're seeing it as a pretty clear blue. So given our limited palette, we're going to make that by mixing white with Payne's gray. And I've talked about the fact that Payne's gray is a blue-black, and I think we can see that very clearly today. On the screen, at least, it looks like it's nearly the same color. It's not white. It's a little bit more. It's a little bit more of a kind of middle neutral gray. But it's actually doing a nice job for us, suggesting, in this case, not only the temperature, but the color itself. So I'm using a large brush. I don't need to be careful here. I'm also blocking in such a way that I'm moving the brush around actively. And remember, it's important to block in right up to the object you've drawn, even maybe merging your block in with the shape itself. And a reason to do that, in other words, allow your brush to almost travel over your contour, is that starts to give a slight softness to the edges, which both starts to suggest an atmosphere, and it can reinforce a sense of the roundness of the object. Now looking again at value, or last week we looked at the value difference between the surface of the paper and the background. I should have this wall extend further out. The value difference, the values are about the same, but they're about the same. But the back wall, the surface that the object is sitting on is just a hair darker than the back wall. Now that's also a much warmer temperature, as people I think can see. So it's a warm temperature, but it's not, I don't want to mix up a color. I don't want to mix up the warmest color on my palette for that. So I'm going to mix a warm color, but I'm gonna mitigate that warmth, or take that warmth. I'm gonna cool that warmth off a little bit with some of the black. And that's the only way we could do that with our palette. There are other ways to cool a color down, obviously. I think that I can, I'm going to just cool that off a little bit more. I think that I'm really looking at using the colors we have to approximate that color temperature. I think that this color should be a little bit less red. Maybe something more like this. Yeah, I think that's better. And so remember, a really important part of blocking in a painting is we just want to be looking at the large masses. So we're not trying to make any fine distinctions in the values. We're not paying attention to any minor shifts in value. There's a multitude of value differences, even in something as broad and flat as those surfaces we're looking at. But we're not going to pay any attention to that right now. What we're going to pay attention to are just the big masses of light and shadow. Okay, so I have my surface and back wall blocked in, which I always highly recommend doing, just because I think it's much easier to, gauge the values, and in our case today, the temperature of these large areas, and then you can use that to make decisions about the value and the temperature of the object you're painting. I do see a lot of online demos where the artists don't do that. They start right with the object. I think it's easier. I always recommend doing the background first. So now I'm going to start looking at the value of the cast shadows and the value of the shadow mass on the object. And remember, what we're looking for is we're trying to identify the relationship of this value to this value, right? The dark to the light in the background, the value relationship of the dark mass on the orange to the value we have for the background. And so if you look, a really important place to look at the value of the shadow mass on the orange here, and ask yourself how that relates to the value of the wall behind it, the wall that's still illuminated here. So this is clearly a darker value. And don't be thrown off by the value of the reflected light. Now that gets quite bright because there's a reflecting surface right here. And if I had been smarter about that in setting this up, I would have put a piece of black paper here so that it didn't quite reflect so much light. You don't want to be confused by areas of reflected light like that. So I'm going to actually, I'm in this way going to make it easy on myself. If I squint at my setup, and people can do that, squint so that you eliminate most detail. If I just look at all the values here, I can block in both the form shadow on the orange and the cast shadow on the tabletop with a similar starter value. That's a value I'm going to change as I develop the painting. But I'm going to start that with a warm, dark value, just to start my painting by establishing a large simple area of shadow. And so I know this may, if we're looking at the cast shadow, or if we're looking at the reflected light on the orange, this may look like a very dark value. I don't think it's actually too dark. I think once we get the rest of the painting blocked in, you'll see why. Look here, compare the value, again, looking at the relationship between the value of the back wall and the value of the shadow on the orange where it meets the back wall. Look how pronounced that difference is. I want to set that up. I want to set up that pronounced difference. So just as an initial block in, Now here, as the planes of the orange roll under, away from the light source, I'm deliberately overstating that dark value. I'm going to lighten that. I'm just going to get a big value mass in. Now, as the cast shadow moves back towards the back wall, it definitely gets lighter, so I'll indicate that. So I'm picking up a little bit of the lighter color I mixed up for this table surface. Again, blocking in a very simple mass of light and shadow. And the temperature of the shadow on the back wall is considerably different. So I'm not going to try to block that in with the same shadow mass or the same set shadow value. So that's going to be a dark, cool color. Although, look at that shadow very carefully, that cool cast shadow on the back wall. So that's a cool color, but I'm reading that as not only darker, but warmer than the blue here. And that's because that part of the wall is getting some reflection from the color of this wall here is brown. It's getting some reflection off the tabletop. So I'm going to make a dark, cool color, but I'm going to put a little bit of red in it to warm it up just a little bit. Because I want it to be both darker, but also warmer than the wall behind. I have my very simple block in of the shadow, the cast shadow shapes. Now, just remembering or thinking about something we've talked about before, we don't want these shapes to just remain clearly defined shapes. So I'm going to bring in the halftone. So if we remember, the halftone is that transitional tone. That softens the transition from shadow into light. And so this is quite a soft. This is quite soft. So I'm just going to scrub in that transitional tone. Again, just sort of feathering that edge. So we can still read the place where we can still read the shapes of light and shadow, or the shadow mass and the light mass, but we also start to indicate that softness. I'm using here a dry brush, blending brush to just start to soften that. And the edge of a shadow is always sharper in some areas and softer in others. I'm likewise going to bring in a half tone. So I'm making a half tone in the warm color mass we mixed up and cooling it down just a little bit.
Professor,
Yeah,
somebody got locked out of the meeting.
I'm sorry.
Somebody's trying to get
Okay.
into the meeting.
Thank you. So just like we have been all semester, going from large masses to smaller masses. So in this case, the large mass of the big shadow shapes, and then bringing in some of those smaller half tones, start softening edges. Okay, so now, we have the shadow masses blocked in, and I realize the form shadow on our object is extremely simple, deliberately simple. So we're going to bring in more complexity to that. But first I'm going to block in my light side on that form. So here, one important point to make in this painting, and this is something that I think people often struggle with in this, is we tend to want to be able to get that fiery orange color when we're painting something like this. Now, with the colors we have, we simply can't do that. There's no way we're going to get that color. And remember, the painting we're doing today is not intended to be matching color. It's intended to use the limited palette we have to start to suggest the variety of warm and cool in what we're looking at. So I'm mixing nothing but white and transparent red oxide in order to come as close as possible to the value of the object we're looking at. So this is going to appear, so I want to make sure I'm getting the value distinction. So the difference between the relative dark of the back wall to the light of the skin of the orange. And this, of course, looks a little bit bricky and doesn't give us that kind of fiery color, but we can't get that. So there's no point in trying. We're just instead trying to suggest, again, the difference between the warmth and the cool. Now, one thing I am going to do, and something that you can start thinking about, is I'm going to start the block in of the light mass by thinning the paint a bit more than I typically do. I don't want to overdo that, but I'm putting down a slightly thinner layer than I might otherwise do. And what that's going to, what that's going to help do is it's going to allow light to pass through this layer of paint a little bit more than otherwise would have been the case. And that light is going to reflect off the white surface of the canvas board. And it's going to pass back through the layer of paint. And what it does is it gives a little bit more. When that happens, we read the color we're putting down as a little brighter and a little bit more intense. So it's just a hair thinner than I would normally do. So blocking the light right up to our shadow shape. So I have this, structural shadow edge, right, where the contour is moving around. It's moving around these different planes that make up the form of the orange. So you want to look for that kind of structural shadow shape. Again, you don't want to just have a kind of carelessly drawn approximation of the shape. You want your shadow shape and the shadow edge, sometimes called the terminator. You want that shadow edge to really define that planar structure that is the point where the form turns away from the light source. So the way I'm going to handle the navel, I'm going to do some wet and wet painting. So I'm going to take my shadow color. And I'm just going to fill in that navel shape. I'm also going to redraw it because I see now that it's closer to the top. And I'll go in with my light. And just start to indicate those small forms that are picking up some light. I'm going to leave it relatively simple right now. So even on this small element I'm painting, I'm just thinking in terms of light and shadow planes. Just indicate them lightly for now. Okay, so what's the next? So we have our big block in. What's the next thing we want to do to a painting that we've brought to this stage? What's the next thing we've done in our painting so far? Not what I'm doing right now. I'm just doing this as I'm waiting. Anyone wants to volunteer? What's the next element we want to start looking for as I clean up the edge? Anyone want to offer a suggestion?
Light and then the shadow toward the left, like not shadow but indirect light on the left side of the orange.
The indirect light, you mean the reflected light?
Yeah, that's like reflecting off the table onto the orange. Like there's the direct point of light on the orange toward the left, and then even further to the left, there's indirect light.
So this light here.
No, on the. Are we backwards?
I can never tell. Do you mean this strongest area of light?
Yes. So there and then to the left, that light doesn't directly hit. Like it kind of curves over, so it's not. It's more of like a shadow, and then like those shadows around where the direct light hits.
Okay, so Morgan, do you mean are you identifying values here as shadow?
I don't think I mean shadow, but not there. they're not directly being hit by the light. Like it's probably light that's being bounced off the table or that's curving around.
Well, let's, so in other words, so you're saying that we're not looking at the lightest part of the orange, right?
Right.
And so that's true. And so from my perspective, the lightest part of the orange, and I'm just going to indicate this with a very simple block of paint. The lightest part of the orange is here. So we have, and what do we call this? What's the word? What's the term for this area on the orange?
The highlight.
The highlight, right.
Highlight.
So we can indicate that. And I'm just, again, I'm going to indicate that very roughly. So that's an element of light and shadow. And so if I start to I usually put that on later, but there's no reason not to put it on now. And in at least on my screen, the way you all are seeing that highlight, it looks larger than it appears to be. So I can just start to indicate that without needing to get into too much about its complexity. So for you all, at least on my screen, this all looks like it's still highlight, which it's not as I'm looking at it. Now, just based on what Morgan said, I just want to point out that, remember, the highlight is created because that's the point on the form where you can make, where the light comes in at an angle to the orange, and then at this point on the form, the light reflects back to my eye at an equal angle. Right? The angle that the light is reflecting from the orange to my eye is equal to the angle of the light hitting the surface here. So that's what creates the highlight. The highlight, though, this is still the light mass. This we refer to as the center light. It's darker than the highlight, but this is still all illuminated. So I just want to emphasize that. And then Morgan, I think, was also referring to the reflected light on the shadow mass. And I am going to, I'm going to paint that. Now I'm going to do something, I'm going to take an approach to dealing with the paint in a way that we haven't really done. I'm actually going to take a dry brush. So this is a brush that has no paint on it. I haven't dipped it in anything. I'm actually going to remove a little bit of paint. And I'm doing that again because there's two reasons I'm doing this. One is sometimes, or very often actually, painters will use a technique where the shadows, the paint in the shadows is thinner than the paint in the lights. And it's a way of creating or reinforcing that illusion we're looking for. But what I'm also doing with this painting in particular, or this setup, is I'm conscious of how warm this reflected light is. And if the paint is thinner, and therefore allowing more light to pass through it, then it's going to read to us as a more intense color. So I'm letting that thinner area of paint, or I'm painting that area thinner, so that I can start to suggest the intensity of that orange reflection. if I added white to that, it would lighten it, but it would also dull it down. And I want to try to suggest, again, I want to try to suggest as much as possible the intensity of that reflected light. Now, before I go on, I'm going to bring in some of the very darkest shadow accents. I'm going to use my Payne's Gray and a little bit of transparent red oxide. And I'm looking at the occlusion shadow underneath the orange. That's a very dark, there's no light getting there. So I'm both going to start to refine the drawing of my contour and start to bring in a fullness of the value range. I think people can see that when we bring in that occlusion shadow, other values in the painting that looked like they were maybe too light are now reading as closer to the way we perceive them. So for the painting due next week, you want to, again, set up a simple still life as we've been doing so far this semester. And choose a piece of, I would recommend a piece of fruit or a vegetable that, again, a relatively simple object. Like I'm painting today, and take the same approach where you're looking to establish those relationships of warm and cool color. So now what's something else we want to find in this painting? What's another element of light and shadow that we need? Or what's an element of light and shadow that this painting is lacking?
The halftone.
The halftone, right. There are several things, but the halftone I think is important to bring in right now. So if we look and we can identify the halftone here, that halftone that's softening that shadow edge, right? And notice also that the halftone is distinctly cooler than both the center light or the light mass and the shadow mass. So I'm going to mix using my shadow mass as a base. I'm going to lighten that a bit. And I'm going to cool it down by bringing in some of my Payne's gray. And I'm going to just start indicating the halftone. And here, so the halftone here, I think we can see is a relatively distinct plane. And it becomes a little bit more, it narrows as we move down. I think I have about the right temperature for the halftone. And this plane of the orange here, that's not completely turned away from the light source, but is at an oblique angle to the light source. The intensity of the color diminishes. Sometimes the color in this kind of context is referred to as the hue, as chroma. Intensity of color is referred to often as chroma. So the chroma drops down or loses intensity, and that entire area goes into this kind of cool, relatively cool halftone. So I'm primarily still taking the same approach, looking for planes of light, planes of shadow, and planes of halftone. and still thinking in terms of planes as we were doing last week. Although I'm allowing the planes to be more organic, so turn more slowly into one another. And I'm going to continue the halftone mix up another halftone, stitch that in. So I can continue to soften that edge. So we retain retain a clarity of light and shadow, but we're allowing that edge to turn. By paying attention to value and light and planes, we can start to convincingly build an object that we read as believably volumetric. And we're starting now to see the color, although just in terms of warm and cool. So I'm now going to clarify a little bit the core of the shadow. I think the core of the shadow should be a little bit cooler. Maybe slightly darker. That's too dark. So I'm looking where the core of the shadow is most pronounced. And so bringing in that core of the shadow is going to further emphasize the warmth of the reflected light. I'm now going to go back to my halftone. And I'm going to be working these areas of halftone, shadow, core of the shadow, reflected light. I'm going to be adjusting until I start to get a convincing depiction of that specific orange that I'm looking at. So I'm looking at the way certain parts of the shadow edge are sharper, certain parts of the shadow edge are softer, and trying to convincingly capture that specific orange. So for today, I actually have to end the demonstration in a few minutes. So I'll bring it up to, I'll bring the live demonstration up to a certain point within a few minutes. I will continue this demonstration and finish this painting and post that so people will have that to see. Does anyone have any specific questions at this point that I can answer right now? Does anybody have any questions about the assignment? So everyone's clear on the assignment for next week? Something I want people to be very careful of, be very conscious of is, as we've been talking today, is how you observe and paint the reflected light. So we have, again, a strong reflected light on this object we're looking at. But we don't want to overstate that. We don't want to make that reflected light so light that it ever interferes, or it not interferes, but it doesn't compete with the lights in the light part of the form. Right? So we want to paint that reflected light so that it reads as a reflection, but that value never gets as light as anything on the light side of the form. It's a really important, it's really important to bear that in mind. So that's something to be conscious of as you work on your paintings. again, I need to wrap it up today in a couple of minutes. Again, I will finish this demo and post the whole demo online. But before we end the demonstration today, again, I just want to ask, does anybody have any questions at all? Or anything I can clarify about the assignments? Okay, so the live part of the demo I'm going to leave here. Again, so for next week, you want to do another very simple painting of a simple organic form in which you not only look for light and shadow, value relationships, you want to try to create a sense of the planar structure you're looking at. And finally, you want to observe and indicate variations of warm and cool. Using white, Payne's gray, and transparent red oxide. So if there aren't any questions, I'm going to sign off here. And you can email me again, so I'm going to sign off here, and you can email me with any questions. Okay?
Okay,
Thank you,
sounds good.
Professor.
Thank you.
I'll end here, and I
Thank
will see
you.
you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.